Hi, I'm still muted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is LISBETH LUNDSTEDT. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am pursuing a master in public administration from the University of Cincinnati, class 2023. My track is in management. Also, I actually took a lot of classes with Alex Nash in the last few years. I am currently the director for supply diversity at the Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And our vision is to have in Cincinnati the healthiest kids in the nation. So a lot of equity discussions around how do we reach that goal within our organization.
Thank you, Lisbeth. So for us to ground ourselves and really get into what social equity is and how we can continue to center it, what does it look like in practice? I want to first start with all of our panelists sharing exactly what social equity is to them. If we're going to talk about this thing, I think it's really important to name it. And so if any of the panelists would like to unmute themselves first, I will not call you out, but I will ask for a volunteer.
Sure, I can start out. Equity is removing barriers so people have access to the same opportunities and making sure that, making sure that historical context is acknowledged moving forward in order to ensure people can all have the same opportunities. Thanks.
This is Lisbeth. From the supply chain management perspective, I think social equity means that every supplier has the same access to compete for businesses in the same way without having any historical background regarding previous performance or long-time traditional suppliers. Like every purchasing decision stands on its own, and everyone has the same opportunity to compete for products and services as equitably.
So I'll add on to that. And again, thank you for introduction. I'm actually really excited to be on this panel with all of you, by the way. To me, it includes fairness and parity. It also includes an examination of systems to ensure, and as a professor, for me, that's extremely important to look at the systems that I'm a part of and how it interacts with students both in the graduate program and undergraduate program. So for me, equity, social inclusion, and examining those systems that interface with a diversity of populations. And so it's, for me, always calling the question and always being present in rooms and making sure that my voice and the voice of those who have been voiceless is a part of that. To me, that's what equity means.
Yeah, I think to me, social equity is that acknowledgement that there's work to be done to undo and I guess, acknowledge and address, systemic barriers that have been in place for a very long time, and to approach any work that you do with that knowledge and not just it feels to me like equity is a step beyond equality, where it's not just about giving every person the same treatment or the same opportunities, but going just a little bit deeper and identifying that there are a lot of other things at play that can impact opportunities for people, that can impact the systems that we as administrators may be running or operating in, and just using that to inform how we're doing things and how we might envision things moving forward.
Thanks all. So to follow up on many of your points, if you see me looking down here, it's because I'm taking notes to move along. But so speaking of things like removing barriers, historical context, examining systems, acknowledgement that there is work to do, right? All of these things are key factors in how we can practice and how we can improve our social equity efforts and work. And so how does that acknowledgement, that work, that removal of barriers, how do those things better academic and professional environments?
So the previous speaker, I was going to add, because I think you said about restorative, I wanted to use the word restorative equity. I'm going to put something in the chat room for that. But I think that's what, when you're talking about, we're talking about parity, or using the word, so use the word reparations, but in that regard, how do we not only make the playing field equal, but how do we create a level playing field by the boats that have been sinking, rising them to the same level? That's what restorative equity looks like for me.
I think in purchasing or in product supply, the way that we do this is by creating development programs for communities that has been historically not being invited to the table. So, for example, in supplier diversity, we will conduct development programs in which we will basically coach and train suppliers to be able to have the same level of attention and the same level of coaching that whole historically incumbent suppliers have gotten. So that is one way that we're trying to remove barriers. Another way is within the access to capital. I mean, what we have, how or the way that we paid our invoices to pay it on shorter terms or immediately upon the supplier presenting them. So there are ways in which we help suppliers to actually have a seat on the table and be able to provide services to us.
Danny or Alex, either of you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I think in the context of academia and in professional settings, I think you know, having a lens of social equity and incorporating it into how you move through those spaces is really important, because you know it of course it just applies to everything. At least in my experience, it's, you know, everything is connected, and the way that, you know, the ways that it shows up in your work, and even just how, you know, you as an individual may move through your workplace or through academia, there's just always learning to be done, in my opinion. And I think that, you know, centering social equity in an academic setting and in a professional setting is really, for me, has been really, really meaningful and really, really enlightening, and just, I think, really important to remind everybody that you know, you're never going to be perfect. So there's not really an arrival point. And I think it does really make for really rich, you know, academic exchange and discourse, because a lot of, I think, especially with public administration, a lot of the foundations that we may be working from in the field are just not, you know, maybe not quite getting to the root of equity. And again, equity versus equality, you know, there just always needs to be that extra step, and to always keep that in mind, even as we look at like the foundations of our field. And that, you know, maybe it was founded at a time where it was a lot of sort of homogenous voices shaping what we now know as public administration today. And I think to use social equity and to keep that in mind as we are studying it and as we're discussing it and practicing it, I think is a really transformative way to also imagine ways that we can do better and to change the field moving forward.
Alex, I agree with that. There were some MPAs that said they graduated from University of Cincinnati, some really heavy hitters writing from that university right now in public administration. I think what's really important for me is to, in my syllabus design and in the text that I prepare for my students, is to make sure that that it looks like us, all of us, And so I'm, when I'm presenting reading material each week, I want to make sure that the students, that my scholar practitioners is what I call them, that they, because they're experts in the field that they're working in, you guys are, absolutely. And so I want to make sure that they're seeing academics who look like them and who mirror their cultural and ethnic experiences. And so I'm always trying to elevate new voices in the field. And I think that's what new public administration is all about, quite frankly. But I think that we have a responsibility to bring more voices into the space, and I think it creates a much more a richer experience for those who are engaged in that kind of a process. Also, examining sort of the cultural experiences that students come from. It's important that you examine, sort of that whole experience, so that your my teaching techniques, are that is able to, I believe, make half classes full classes, and so to examine where people are and to try to always teach up.
Yeah, and piggybacking off my colleagues, in centering equity, it also allows for more innovation within the field and within research. So we see all the different opportunities that are there, and you see that through equitable representation. You see that through expanding who is considered a scholar and who is considered a practitioner. And you also see that then moving into the field, right? Because you take those experiences from the degree and from that in how you interact with both colleagues and also clients and a practitioner standpoint. So thank you.
Yes, and that is a great segue into something else. Dr. Franklin, you mentioned student practitioners and acknowledging that they are working in the field, they have the expertise, right? A lot of times when you enter like a classroom or some kind of training or any kind of opportunity to learn something new, it's easy to default into like, I'm the student, I need to sit here, be quiet, and not really say too much, not recognizing your own value that you have to add. And so what role or where does social equity belong in helping folks who are there to learn also understand that they can help others learn? It's a mutual learning experience. How does social equity help with that?
Is that a question for me first?
It's for all the panelists. It's for everyone. But you really it was a great segue when you made that connection.
I had, and I think that's one of my classes 2 years ago, right in the middle of COVID, I had one of my Latinx students begin to talk about an exchange program that she was a part of, and how the professor, who was also Latinx experience, really began to talk about sort of this value and importance of and we hear this in the Black community, we're expected to come back to the community with these talents and skills. There's great expectations for us. And when I heard that, I just smiled, because I realized that, that we sort of all, whether we be female or a person of color or a person of a different ethnic experience, or, our first generation, we're coming here with sort of those same cultural expectations. And so I think that that's kind of built in the sense that we're sort of programmed to reach back and to help each other. I think that the barrier, there is a barrier to that, in academic settings, is because some institutions are sort of sanitized, and there's a distance. And so I think that that sometimes can be a negative factor in impacting. But I think that break down those barriers so that we all able to see each other as a value in the learning environment, and as a future value to the workforce, and that we value you now because you're in the field doing this work, and you're the practitioners, and that so we're bringing all of those things to the table. I think that shifting the paradigm around the teaching experience and learning experience, I think is a major sort of mitigating factor to shifting how that we all value and can help each other. I'm complete.
And just to jump in on that too, I think building off of that, the perspective of lifelong learning, especially in the field of PA, where things are constantly changing, where narratives change as well as demographics we work with, it's really important to make sure that that is a piece in both the research as well as in the field, so we can approach things from an equitable standpoint as we learn more and develop from there.
Alex or Lisbeth, do you want to add on to that at all?
Yeah, this is just sort of, I think, making me think about another aspect of my definition of social equity, or what that means to me, is that that sense of community care. And, you know, in addition to that lifelong learning, that there is, to me, it feels like there is baked into that a sense of caring for each other and wanting to see, to lift up others and to support and collaborate with others. So I think that inherently fosters this environment where, ideally, everyone is there to learn and to grow together. And of course, that's not always perfect, and everyone's coming to the table, at different points in their journey. But I think typically, painting in broad strokes here, that folks that are interested in social equity are interested, and coming with a sense of humility and readiness to be open, to be vulnerable, and to be prepared to have some hard conversations, and maybe have some of their their prior knowledge challenged in a way that can, I think, be really transformative and can really help folks grow. And I think that's where there's so much value to be had in valuing lived experience and centering that in equity work. I think that's something that's really powerful in those scenarios, in those contexts.
Lisbeth, you're still muted.
I did, because there was noises in the background, so please forgive me. I just would like to add that the piece of transformation, because after you go through the MPA program and you know about, and you get immersed into the social equity and social justice, then I find in myself, for example, when I'm listening to podcasts, just analyzing what kind of language do the participants are using, how do they use hierarchy or oppositions, or how are they aligning and finding that they connect to the topics, and that's just one piece of many. That also the communities, the struggles of different communities in North America, and the different situation. It's just, you feel like it's something different that we never talked before, or we talked superficially before getting into the in-depth analysis. So there is a transformation taking place. We just see it in a different lens, that even when we go back to our workplace as a practitioners, we see that there is still a gap, and that's what I just wanted to add into this.
Thank you.
I'm adding some resources to the room. I just kind of mirror what we're discussing. I think that citizen participation, I think we probably all talked about and heard about community participatory action and how that impacts local governance and government. I do think that is one of the driving forces of the 21st century around social equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so I think that as public administrators, we're trying to catch up to sort of the social activism of the 70s, 80s, 90s. That there's a lot has changed in the landscape of this country and in the world globally, and this has sort of been a male-dominated world for centuries. And so now the public administrators and public sector and 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 even private sectors trying to catch up. And so the issue, so social equity and inclusion and community engagement, I think, are driving this much the way George Floyd drove, corporations to rethink their diversity, equity, inclusion in just a matter of perhaps 90 days, a couple of years ago. So I believe that the public is really the driving force around sort of these shifts that we're seeing as administrators, as public administrators, and public sector employees.
Yeah, and I would also like to ask that, or like to add, excuse me, that in the diversity, equity, and inclusion work, we're also seeing a trend in adding a B at the end, right? So instead of DEI work, it's DEI, B as in boy, and that's for belonging. So it's understanding that, you're included in this, right? We're trying to make the system more equitable, and we want everyone here to be diverse, but also like, we want you to feel like you belong, right? Like your voice is just as valuable as anyone else's, things like that. I will get back to moderating. I apologize. So my next question is really about like how centering social equity shaped your understanding of policy and social issues, whether this is when you started to center social equity in your work, or when you started to center it in your studies. I would just like to know how that helped you understand, again, policy and social issues.
I'll jump in on this one. Because I think I had sort of little nuggets or inklings of, okay, this seems like this is maybe connected sort of throughout my career. And for context, I feel as though I am coming to public administration with a semi non-traditional background. I worked as a music teacher and an educator for 3 years in Columbus City schools. And after that, I pursued 2 years of service with the Peace Corps, also in education. So, fairly non-political science leaning fields. So I did feel a bit out of my depth when I started this program, but at University of Cincinnati. And, the way that it centers social justice and social equity was a big draw for me to the program. And I think one of the things that just really struck me almost immediately in our coursework and in our studies was how much of this I had already seen in my work, without really contextualizing, and seeing, firsthand how everything is so connected. And I, maybe sounds a bit vague and sort of kitschy, but it just really feels so true. And, as a former educator, and someone that worked in a school that served a lot of families and students that were experiencing the interconnectedness of various systemic barriers, that really shaped, between that and then entering a program that's centering social equity in its analysis of policy and public administration, was, I think, really, really powerful for me. And really, I don't want to say disheartening, because I don't think that's quite the right word, but there are some days where it sometimes is daunting to acknowledge that, I might feel, when I started, I maybe felt that education would really be the only policy area where I could ever claim expertise. But now, after finishing my program, I'm like, actually, I think I could make a strong case for pretty much anything, because education just impacts so many other areas, and vice versa, health and environment. And of course, I'm sure many of us know this if we're as public administrators, but being in a program where that's centered was really eye-opening for me. And there were plenty of days where it was frustrating as well, to know that the current way that it feels our systems are structured doesn't always make space for that, or doesn't always hold space for the truth that one targeted solution is not going to fix a large problem all on its own. So I guess it's two sides of the same coin, that it's both eye-opening and frustrating, because it sometimes will feel as though what we have in place right now isn't cutting it clearly, and is not going to cut it. However, I believe it was Danny's comment earlier that, you know, these programs and these environments and these conversations really do foster a sense of innovation. I think is what also gives me a lot of hope and a lot of encouragement, because I feel like I just see things more clearly. And you know, to carry that lens with me going into, you know, as an early public administrator and, you know, professional, feels daunting for sure, but also I think feels like an asset.
I'll jump in. So I'm going to translate, Chair, just for a little bit. What I think I heard you say was, I am the case study. I've seen all of this, and I am the case study. And you know, and so my motivation was about that. You know, having worked for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference as with Dr. Lowry, and run programs and assisted as chief of staff, and you know, and several, you know, specifically African American nonprofit organizations, I felt like I really understood what the challenges were around sustainability and resilience of the organizations that look like me. That's where I was working, including arts organizations. And so going back to school for me was about, I think I know how to fix some of these challenges. Perhaps, you know, having, you know, some additional credentials would give me more voice in the room around, you know, other people would hear me, you know, and from a different lens. And so I do think that did happen, and that has occurred. And so I do think, this is back to you, Alex, but so you are uniquely equipped now, you know, and understand how to solve these very problems that you probably looked at for a number of years. As now a scholar practitioner, you are and have, you know, sort of the same power. I mean, as an academic and now as a teacher, you know, a professor, you know, my students, I tell them all the time, you know what the problem is, the problems are, and so what we're talking about is methodology and theory, you know, and you know, all the canons, but just use this as a vehicle to translate, to fix these issues. You uniquely prepared to do that.
As I mentioned, I graduated. Sorry.
I said, I know that was directed at Alex, but then I was like, okay, I'm empowered. Let's end this panel and let's get to work. I'm just kidding. Go ahead, Danny.
No, you're all good. So having graduated and immediately moved into practice, I can say that the organization I work for does center marginalized populations in HIV and AIDS prevention. And so I've been able to now take all of that, talking about what the problem is and what the problem is, and see ways different organizations go about solving it, right? And part of the equity-centered education and curriculum that UIS had provided has allowed me to kind of ask the right questions in my first week or so of onboarding, both in ways of understanding how this organization approaches the problem and where my piece in that is. I think it's also kind of allowed me to start centering who's being left out instead of who I see all over and over and over again. And that does go back to the innovation piece and the research too, where I know it can be really tempting as a student to go along with whatever has the most lit on it right now and kind of go down the path of least resistance, but being able to kind of push what we traditionally know and push the ideas that have kind of been fed to us in the PA program is important too. And it's great to be in an environment where professors support that, but until your environment is that, making sure you're leaving room for that is really important too.
Any other additions?
I mean, I don't really have an experience where I do lead the policy, but what I'm doing at Cincinnati Children's Hospital is trying to influence on what the organization is going in terms of having to fulfill their vision of creating Cincinnati the healthiest kids in the nation. And so when I get into meetings with my peers, I challenge what is their really causes that they are pursuing. For example, if we want to have the healthiest kids in the nation, how we leverage our power with the water systems and or the transportation systems, or and what are the connections that as organization we are establishing with the local government, so we ensure that our kids do get access to food, do they get access to supermarkets, do get access, especially in the summer. So those kind of examples. And I don't think I own the policy, but I do influence what the people are doing in terms of where they're expecting, they're investing in resources, in time to serve our kids.
So one more question that I wanted to ask about the integration of social equity. It has to do more with what does it look like in practice? I've already heard a few of those things, like making sure there's representation in curriculum, making sure there's representation in authors when you are taking a course and you have some literature to read, things like that. But anything else you would like to add? How else does integration show up in practice?
I'd just like to add stakeholder engagement. I'm going to mirror that back because I heard Elizabeth talking about sort of the power that she has in public policy and shifting the policy and looking at all of these indicators that impact quality of life and health. By the way, I serve on the board of Harlem Hospital in New York City. And so I want to say that how we engage and empower stakeholders and we bring them to the table is extremely important. And, looking at, particularly if you're looking at healthcare and access to healthcare, COVID really did a number on our community over the last, all communities over the last, 3 years, going on 3 years now, it seems like. And I've written an article on that, by the way. But I would suggest that so outward-facing community empowerment and engagement has to be at the table and as a part of our public policy approach. And as administrators, we not only need to bring them to the table to empower them and to ensure that their voices are as important as the PhD or the community based organizational leader who's sitting at the table, that they have the same power. Their voice is important. So I do think that is certainly has to be a community strategy and one that can influence, long-term outcomes.
Danny or Alex, do you have any additions?
Yeah, I think that when I think about, incorporating social equity and what that really looks like in practice, of course, there's always going to be that, that individual level and that person, some level of personal responsibility for your continued learning and continued growth. And I do think, continued humility as you move through your work, knowing that, I think being really mindful of how, both your motivations and your approach to things and the way, as Dr. Franklin said, and Lisbeth and Danny have noted, the way you're interacting with the communities that you're collaborating with, and being really, I think, mindful of your power and, mindful of your power and privilege and your positionality and being prepared to challenge and reimagine what to be, the way that we conduct research or the way that we engage with stakeholders. Not at all saying that there are not ways now that are, that are mindful and effective and collaborative. I know that we are making that shift, and and people have been doing that for years, and that's I think a really, you know, a beautiful thing to be able to reference and sort of ground us as we think about, you know, how we're compensating the folks that are, you know, the representative populations that, or the representative individuals that we want to see at the table, and, you know, how we're inviting them into those spaces. Are they, you know, where are they at the table? Are they, I mean, I guess I'm stuck on a table metaphor now, but, you know, thinking about like, are we just finding one community group and sort of, you know, haphazardly working with them and sort of touching base every now and then? Or like, are we really, you know, showing up and asking like, what can we do for you? Or how can we support you? And thinking about that, like, you know, in terms of practice in the classroom too, like what professors are we hiring? What guest speakers are we inviting to things? So, you know, I think in practice, or is that the word we use? I think in practice, or in, I think that's such a perfect word for it, right? Like practice to me implies, as a musician, that, you know, it's not going to be perfect every time. And that, you know, it's a process, and that it's not, or maybe we are perfect one day and then the next day, you know, we slip up. It's going to happen. And I think to just keep that in mind, as we're doing this work in administration, or in, you know, in academia, as educators, as public servants, I think that's, to me, one of the most central things of what social equity in practice looks like.
Can we agree that, well, to me, let me just say that diversity, equity, inclusion, and now belonging, I think that it's aspirational, number one. But it is a hallmark. I mean, Renz, Hall, several scholars talk about it as, you know, the hallmark of good governance is, you know, belonging and feeling valued in the workplace. And so we can all agree that that is, you know, and should be the standard. I have responsibility in my workplace, and and whatever my ethics are, you know, if I'm going to be true to my ethics, and ensuring that the workplace is fair for everyone, as a manager or senior manager, or, you know, C-suite, or the person just came in yesterday, they just got hired, that they have the same, they're going to be treated with the same ability and the same fairness. So, but again, it's aspirational, and we have to hold it to that standard, though.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And the piece I want to add on this is a point about advocacy and how that is key in integration. So this is beyond advocating for others, but also making sure students and practitioners have access to self-advocate if they are in situations where they're being targeted for a protected group, or if the policy is changing in a way that makes them unsafe, knowing that they have access to those resources to be able to speak up and have the space to change that narrative and change that environment is important too.
Good point.
Okay. Lisbeth, I heard you come off mute. Did you want to add anything?
No, I think Danny mentioned a very good point, that and a typical example of this is when we're getting into an organization and the organization doesn't provide the resources that we need to be successful. I think one of the recommendations that I have is basically just ask, say, I need this. In order for me to be successful, I really need this kind of resources. Otherwise, we won't be successful in what we're trying to do in driving diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So we don't want to go into an organization and just be there. I mean, we really need resources to influence, and we need to make vocal and be strong and just say, yeah, I need this to make change happen.
Thank you for that addition. So now I would like to actually open it up for the audience to be able to ask any questions that they would like to. So if you have a question, you can feel free to use the chat, or if you would like to use the raise hand function. And then we can like start up a queue if we have more than one in the raise hand function. Please let us know if you have questions now. No worries if not, because I have more. So don't feel too pressured. I will kick us off with the first, oh, nope, we got a hand raised. All right. I apologize if I mispronounce your name. Please correct me. Is it Aris or Maricela? I'm sorry. If
For
you are
someone
speaking,
that
there you go.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. Sorry about that. What recommendations does the panel have for individuals that are interested in becoming, that are interested in a position at a governmental agency, which is focused on DEI, yet the state agency's focus is policy? You've all mentioned that engaging stakeholders is necessary. How can the new person, especially if there's somebody from an underrepresented community, make sure that the needs of those communities and their needs, because they're going to have that knowledge, take preference and are given the importance versus just the policies? Thank you.
As someone that is hopefully entering the field of public policy in a governmental agency or through federal or state avenues, I appreciate this question a lot because I will probably benefit from its answer. And you know, in this moment, I have my possibly idealized and possibly you know, naive and sort of maybe not feasible idea of how one could address that. But you know, that question does also spark for me thoughts of like, you know, what I think like what areas of policy a new employee would have power in interacting with, you know, as like, are we talking drafting policy, or are we at the stage of like policy analysis and evaluation or implementation? Because I think even within, you know, policy just as a realm or as a field, I think each of those has very different implications for, you know, actionable steps to prioritize, you know, equity and prioritize the communities that that have been, you know, historically marginalized and oppressed. And you know, as a new employee, which will hopefully be me in the future, I'll admit I'm not sure, you know, how much power you're coming to the table with in a, you know, in an agency, in an, you know, governmental agency setting. But you know, I do have this firm belief that you know, individuals hopefully have the power to, you know, push back and to challenge how we're approaching policy and how, you know, like thinking about you know, unintended consequences of things, or challenging, you know, so-called colorblind policies, and really highlighting the ways in which that can actively be harmful to, you know, to communities of color or to any, you know, any marginalized group that may be being impacted disproportionately. So, you know, without further context, I know that's not a very specific or helpful answer, but those at least are the first thoughts that came to mind for me.
Yeah, I think also and thank you, Alex, for trying to put some more framework around this one. I think that's a great question, but policy in the cycle of policy, how policy is, you know, arrived at, education around it, the engagement of stakeholders, understanding what the needs are and the challenges. I mean, there's a whole life cycle, before any policy is ever written or brought to the table, or that framework, before that framework even begins around, advocacy of the policy, what's the identification of the problem. So if you are, thinking about, and there's an art to legislation and writing policy. I've been there and I understand that. And, it doesn't, you don't get that kind of experience, even, coming out of a grad school and not ever worked around, in sort of a legislative agenda. So it's really important to kind of figure out what aspect of sort of legislation and policy where you want to begin to develop that expertise. So I would suggest that if that's your interest, and you certainly come to the community, come into the workforce as a stakeholder and one who's influential, representing an underrepresented community, that it's important to kind of figure out how you're going to develop the expertise you need in order to have the kind of power and influence that you will need, and bringing the voice of your community to the table. So there's a lot of still much more work in terms of strengthening and developing the tool set that you'll need, your toolkit, in order to be of influence.
Well, thank you for your question, and thank you, Alex and Maurice, for your thoughtful answers. I'm going to go to the next question I see here in the chat. Theodore, did you want to ask your question by unmuting yourself, or would you like for us to just read your question? All right, we will go ahead and read the question then. It says, as educators, scholars, and practitioners, the onus of equity reform is on us within higher education environments. What do you feel is the most optimal method to approach administrators, faculty, or staff that may feel effectiveness or efficiency must be sacrificed for equity? How should equity propagators refute attempts made to diminish equity initiatives by the decision makers within the academic environment as a meso or MECO levels?
So I think the biggest consideration in this is this effective and efficient for everyone? Because once you bring that to the table and once you bring that into question and start to look a little deeper into it, you'll find that it's not always the most efficient method for every group of people, and it's not always that way. So with due effort, you can help administrators or staff approach it in a way that equity is the most effective option and it is the most efficient option. So it's kind of overarching, and yeah, that's what I've got for now. Thanks.
Equity propagators is such a hot word, first of all. And to whom is it most beneficial and least beneficial? I mean, as a new faculty, and you're bringing, innovation, new ideas, perhaps around social equity, diversity, and inclusion, it's always, for me, important to bring it in the same way that I wrote my dissertation. And so I feel like I have to be overly prepared, and to deal with, which is the next question around microaggressions. I feel like I have to be more than prepared whenever I present ideas, which is not fair. I shouldn't have to do that. It's way too much to have to do that, but that's what I do in order to, to make my point or to try to make a point around any kind of social change. Or, right now I'm, addressing the issues around how we can create a more equitable experience for, students of color at the university where I'm teaching, and looking at our curricula and syllabus and, in preparation for preparing them to graduate, but that whole presentation required, a 25-page paper, and it shouldn't, but it does. It's not right.
And just really quick, I would like to add, I'm sure you guys are familiar with curb cut effect, which is often spoken in terms of working with disability access, but it also applies to equity in terms of working with people of diverse backgrounds and genders and races too. So once you take that idea that the investment in one group can help benefit the entire group, it kind of speaks to equity, as well as speaking to efficiency and effectiveness.
Yeah, I think my gut reaction when I see like, you know, when I encounter someone or just a, you know, a general, you know, entity that maybe is not, you know, that seems more concerned about effectiveness and efficiency, or that they would use those two, you know, those two ideas to counter proposed equity initiatives. To me, that ultimately it feels as though like that tells me that they prioritize effectiveness and efficiency over equity. And again, you know, that's painting with broad strokes. It's not always that simple at all, but you know, it does feel like it just comes down to a question of like, what are your priorities, you know, as an institution, or as what are those faculty and administrator priorities? Because it sounds like based on that question, maybe equity is not their priority, or it might take some convincing to make it their priority. And you know, as Danny and Dr. Franklin mentioned, that you know, you may have to spin that for them, which is unfortunate, because I feel like that's why would you have to spin that you should prioritize equity? It seems like a fairly, you know, it's not too crazy thing to want to support. And yet, you know, money is a thing, time is a thing. So to, you know, to advocate and, you know, challenge like, okay, but who is this really working for now? And to maybe go further and use those priorities and leverage those. Like, I see that you care about effectiveness and efficiency. Here's why not centering equity actually harms that for our institution or for our students.
Yeah. In the interest of time, we have about 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure we get to Regina's question. So Regina, would you like to ask your question yourself, or would you like me to read that question? If you would, unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you all so much for this wonderful session. It's been very, very enlightening, and I've learned another acronym of belonging. I like that, adding a belonging, and it triggered this question actually for me as we've been trying to do this type of work inside of our classrooms and embedding things. And you know, we've had some conversations about anti-racism work, particularly since we're a shared school and we have a great social work program, and so they brought a different perspective to us. And in the field of public administration, it felt so much more comfortable as our students were talking, as our faculty were talking, to talk about social equity. But then as we start to think about it, were they the same thing? Are they different? Does it look different in underneath our guise of having not to really be sometimes at the forefront of policy development and policy agenda setting, but in that secondary role of implementation? And so in short, within the field, are we addressing both? Are we addressing them differently? Are we addressing them through different lenses? And I didn't have any answers, and I just wanted to know if you guys had any.
Any of our panelists want to jump in here?
I have some brief thoughts, but I feel like I've taken up a lot of space, so I'll try to be short. But I think, you know, in short, to me, anti-racism work is social equity work, and that anti-racism is a foundation of social equity, and you cannot, in my opinion, you cannot do social equity work without engaging in anti-racism work. I think it should be central to it. And I think, you know, there may be, but, you know, I think to our point earlier, defining social equity ourselves, you know, each individual might not feel the same. So that's, you know, that's my personal perspective. I think anti-racism should also be rooted in everything we do as educators and administrators. And maybe not everyone agrees with that. I have a suspicion that probably most people in this setting agree with that, but it might not be the case elsewhere.
Yeah, the only thing that I would like to add is basically, is for example, I completed this semester the Preparing Future Faculty program at the University of Cincinnati. And within that concept, I was participating on a mentoring experience on a private, predominantly Caucasian institution here in Cincinnati. What I did was basically inviting the students to come with me, visit the National Underground Railroad Center. So we have the experience engaging the students into an immersed teaching experience. So beyond going into the books, the classic books and the new publications, we were actually able to see the latest cases of racism and violence against women and human trafficking and disparities in outcomes. And so the students get to experience that. And we have this jewel here in Cincinnati, which is amazing for us. But that will be my one way. Like, I totally agree, anti-racism is at the center of social justice and social equity. And then immersing the students into the experience, I think is one way to further the knowledge.
So Lisbeth, I hate to cut you slightly short, but we have reached the end of this panel. I just want to thank everyone so much for attending today. And I also just want to leave on this note, oftentimes in the work that we do with anti-racism, as the last question asked, but also in social equity, we're required to enter hubs of harm, places that make us may feel unsafe or uncomfortable, microaggressions, macroaggressions. And so just make sure that you're paying close attention to the environment that you are entering in. Please prioritize your self-care and make sure that your mental and physical well-being is your #1 priority. We need you healthy. We need each other healthy. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.